So, hello everybody. Today we are going to talk about changes in late 19th century America. This is a particularly interesting time period, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. It sort of set the stage for everything that was to come, and much of how our lives are today owe a great deal of gratitude to this particular time in our history. And I will focus a little bit on the United States in particular as an example of what was to come later on. So let's just dive into the material and have a look at, first of all, what do we mean by the late 19th century? Before I get to that, I'm just going to show you a little map. This depicts how the United States looked, I believe, in 1897, so almost at the turn of the century. You'll notice that almost all of the 50 states can be visible. At the time, neither Alaska nor Hawaii were states yet. You can see on the map very clearly where the Rocky Mountains are, a little bit less clearly, but still visible, the Appalachians. To the right, you have the original 13 colonies, which started off our whole story back in the late 18th century. But at this point, we're talking about 100 years down the line. And I'm going to mention right now what I refer to when I say the late 19th century. So technically, if you were to go back through time, you could quite easily see more or less what we mean by, the Revolutionary period, the colonial period, even the Civil War. But the period of time that follows the Civil War is known as the Reconstruction era. It is a time during which the United States was trying to heal from the tragedies of the war and attempt to reunite the North and the South economically, politically. Obviously, this was not a very successful venture, but it will also not be the focus of today's presentation. It is followed by the Gilded Age, and these years are very rough. They're approximate, and they're followed later. These years are later followed by the Progressive Age, which sort of is the tail end of the 19th century, but also continues into the 20th century. I'm going to focus on just the Gilded Age at the moment. But I also wanted to mention that there is a little bit of overlap with the Belle Époque era in France and with a certain part of the Victorian era. Obviously, the Victorian era started much earlier, but a lot of what we imagine when we think about the Victorian era is the later half. So, the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1895, approximately. If you don't know what gilded means, that's okay. It does probably remind you of another word, gold, and you wouldn't be too far off. The term actually started to come into use in the 1920s and 1930s, and it was borrowed from a book that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the famous Mark Twain. Maybe you had to read Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn when you were in elementary school. He was a very prolific writer, and he actually wrote this book in conjunction with another author. So this work was published in 1873. It's called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, and it more or less satirizes the so-called promised golden age that was meant to take place after the Civil War, which I mentioned earlier as the Reconstruction Age. Um, this was a time of serious social problems, and he claimed that it was masked by a thin gold gilding of economic expansion. Now, there are lots of new things going on in the world, in the United States, that helped make this era what it is, not least of which, of course, are the technical advances that took place. So, this is a time of great economic growth. And if you have more money, you obviously are able to invest in the production of things. We have this growth in industrialization that places the United States far ahead of Britain, which was the other most similar superpower in terms of influence and wealth at that time. We see that the United States is starting to have a rapidly growing economy in terms of heavy industry. So we're talking about the factories, we're talking about the railroads, obviously coal mining, and in at some point in the 1870s, the United States was able to connect the East Coast to the West and by doing so accomplished the Grand Transcontinental Railroad. This was only able to happen because of lots of new innovations in the production of steel and access to coal mines, which obviously helped with the powering of said engines as well as the factories. Um, you can see that a lot of the growth in railroad was unable to occur had it not been for financial investment. And this is where we start seeing the growth of the so-called trusts. Those are a few corporations that have a monopoly on everything. I'll mention that a little bit again, a little bit more again later on. But I did want to mention that we would not have probably had all of these railroads had it not been for the investments of some giant corporations. Um, so, as I said, economic growth. When we think of economic growth, we're probably thinking about Wall Street, right? The United States, New York City, Manhattan. Well, that is a big part of it. I wanted to mention that apart from uh, apart from that, we have growth in things like real wages and just wealth overall. We start to see a great leap in the output of things like wheat and corn and obviously coal. Miles and miles and miles upon miles of railway track continues to be laid. And obviously, all these things needed to have some sort of a financial backer behind them. And this is where we have the industrialists and the financiers. We have, of course, John D. Rockefeller. Think about Rockefeller Plaza today. We have Mellon and Carnegie. Maybe you've heard of Carnegie Mellon University. If you haven't heard of Mellon, you've probably heard of Andrew Carnegie, who invested a lot of his money in all over the world, in fact, especially in the building of things like libraries, if that sounds familiar to you. We also have a Vanderbilt University, by the way, as well as a Guggenheim and Frick Museum, and there are others. These people were very often labeled by their critics as robber barons because they would argue that the way that they had made themselves wealthy was at the expense of the working class and by betraying democracy. But the people who believe that there are more, that the more euphemistic term to refer to them would be captains of industry, are the ones who believe that they didn't only build the core of the American industrial economy, they also channeled their excess money into philanthropy. which of course is true. I mentioned Andrew Carnegie, who donated much of his wealth to the building of libraries and, well, schools and hospitals, museums as well. Um, yeah, this is definitely something that we cannot, we would be remiss not to mention. So, economic growth, definitely the birth of corporations, and also this French looking word on your screen, laissez faire capitalism. Now, laissez faire comes from the French, of course, and it means more or less let it be. It means we should not interfere with it. We should let, nature take its course. We should let the forces of the market determine how wealth is created and distributed. And above all else, do not let the government interfere because that's not its duty. Of course, it's wealth is never going to be fairly distributed amongst the people if somebody does not intervene, or if you don't have people with a kind enough heart to look around themselves and realize, hey, look at all this money we have. Maybe it would make sense if we shared this with the rest of the world. And this is where we actually start to see this huge rise in inequality. Um, Basically, the wealthiest 1% owned over a quarter of the economy. The bottom 50% didn't even own 5%. And more contemporary academics such as Howard Zinn and the late Howard Zinn, the historian, and the present day French economist Piketty were noticing these things when they talked about the disparity that went along with poor living conditions, and this would eventually lead to the rise of movements such as the populists and the anarchists and the socialists. And the United States at this point was becoming increasingly non egalitarian and was starting to resemble more and more the old Europe, which is what it was sort of trying to distance itself from, and in fact was its primary identity for such a long period of time. Its pioneering ideal was becoming a distant past. And this is why we eventually start to see the rise of things like labor unions. As more and more jobs that focus on a craft start to become threatened, this is a moment that these skilled workers sort of decide to seize their opportunity to demonstrate that no, without us, you cannot have a growing economy at the expense of our rights. And eventually they argue for the 8-hour workday, in which, as your image shows you, people are allowed 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours to dedicate to their leisure. Maybe it's reading a magazine, maybe it's rowing a boat, maybe it's, whatever people feel like doing, that is their time to do with what they will. And you do start seeing the rise of strikes, and these strikes were efforts in exercising democratic rights, but they were not always treated fairly. The employers, the bosses, would sometimes employ cruel measures such as firing everybody who decided to walk off the job, even though they were just trying to find, a common ground that would be beneficial to all. Um, or they would even bring in people to break up these strikes and just hire somebody else, and meanwhile place the people who had gone on strike on a blacklist. thereby not allowing them to provide for their families. And eventually, we do see the start of the American Federation of Labor, which was headed by Samuel Gompers, who was seeking some sort of bread and butter unionism. And by this, we mean that he wasn't looking for a more socialist avenue, but just one that worked well with the American model. Politics. So we start seeing the rise of the third party system because obviously, even today, bipartisanship in most countries around the world is the de facto norm. And the United States wasn't much different. You still have the Democrats and the Republicans being referred to as the GOP, the Grand Old Party. And the two would fight over control of offices and economic issues. And in fact, voter turnout was quite high back then in comparison with nowadays. These competitions between the parties would come quite close, um, but obviously there would have to be a winner near the end. But at the same time, we do start seeing minor parties coming and going that especially focused on issues that concerned them in particular, maybe labor unions, maybe farmers' rights, maybe prohibitionists, which were people who were dedicated to the prohibition of alcohol. And we start seeing, well, maybe I should just go back to that really quickly to mention that we do have the rise of political machines in which the people would support a candidate in exchange for some sort of patronage, the whole you rub my back, I rub yours system. And people's votes would be bought with the expectation that once their candidate became elected, they would help distribute more jobs in their favor or look the other way if some rights were being trampled on. The most notorious of the political machines was Tammany Hall in New York City, and its most notorious leader was known as Boss Tweed. And you will see a lot of cartoons, caricatures of him if you look back in history books that feature him because he was quite notorious. You start seeing lots of scandals with corruption and bribes, and eventually we start seeing a whole subgenre of journalism called muckraking, in which people would attempt to expose these evils by publishing articles and eventually books about the subject. Although this already touches on the beginning of the 20th century, I would be remiss not to mention Upton Sinclair's famous book, The Jungle, which eventually led to the creation of the FDA, which was put into place to protect consumers of food and medicines so that there was a system in place to ensure that what they were purchasing was what they expected to get, what they were being told that they were going to get. So yeah, just going to mention really briefly ethnocultural politics, just because at the time the United States may have seemed more of a diverse world than it might appear today. We take it for granted nowadays that most people speak English, but at the time in the United States, you had a lot of people coming in from a lot of different countries interacting with each other. Yes, absolutely. But at the same time, living in their little enclaves and in which they would communicate in the language of the old country and continue to prepare food in the same manner, and of course, follow the faith of their mother nation, etc. Now, We see a rise in the clashing of these peoples that came over. Here we have an example of Romanism, and rebellion, which is meant to refer to the liquor interests in terms of the rum, as opposed to the GOP, which was more in favor of prohibition. Romanism is a reference to Roman Catholics, but more specifically to the Irish Americans, who were more in charge of the Democratic Party in most of the cities. And the rebellion is a sort of hat tip to the Democrats of the Confederacy, who were trying to break with the Union in 1861, which harkens back to references to the Civil War. We see religious lines being drawn. We see a division between Catholics and Protestants. And a lot of cultural issues start to appear in terms of, should we just stop consuming and producing alcohol altogether? Should foreign language schools be encouraged or discouraged? We see a lot of divisions here based on cultural lines, and that's why this slide is referred to as ethnocultural politics. So, yeah. Immigration. This is a time when a lot of people start coming over from particularly Europe, but also I would be remiss not to mention China, as many of the workers on the railroad were actually from China. And afterwards, the people who had come over were allowed to stay, but further new immigration was blocked for many, many decades afterwards. So we see about 20 million new immigrants coming to the United States during the Gilded Age. A lot of them were prosperous. They had the money and to buy land in the plains area, so the sort of Midwest area of the United States. But we also see a lot of poor people seeking the American dream, and they were relegated to unskilled manual labor as opposed to skilled kind, which we mentioned earlier with the labor unions. So they would be working in the mills, in the mines, in the factories. And eventually a reception center was built in New York City at a place called Ellis Island near the Statue of Liberty, which you can see here in the picture. And I wanted to mention the famous quote that is engraved on the Statue of Liberty by the American poet Emma Lazarus, who died at age 38. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And this poem is called The New Colossus. This was the message that a lot of immigrants would see upon their arrival. We start seeing an influx of immigrants from Germany, from Britain, from Ireland, from Scandinavia. Yes, they continue coming, but in far fewer numbers than people coming from other nations, from the poorer nations such as Italy and Poland, Russia and Greece. Lots of people coming over from from Southern and Central Europe. And prior to the age that we are referring to at the moment, we had a much larger influx from Ireland during the Great Potato Famine. And their first few decades in the United States were characterized by social dislocation and poverty and violence in the slums. The new immigrants, primarily Italians, Poles, and Jews, were also Italians, and Greeks and Italians, especially a lot of times saw themselves as only temporary immigrants, people who would come over to work, make some money, and then go back to their homes. And in the cases of some people, particularly people from Greece, this tended to be the reality. But many people came over with no plans on ever returning to the old country, particularly the Jews who had been driven out from Europe via the pogroms. Now, I briefly wanted to mention urban versus rural life. As far as urban life goes, we start seeing the rise of the Chicago skyscrapers. We start seeing crowded tenements, which of course led to the spread of germs and the introduction of the very first gangs. But we also see the introduction of things like pavement and the electric trolleys, along with horse-drawn carriages. Eventually, in 1890, Boston gets its first subway, and New York City gets its first subway 10 years later. The Granger, which is an image you can see here to the right, is an example of a person in a rural area. Obviously, we see, especially with the Homestead Act of 1862, we see a lot of people moving out west, creating their own farms. The United States government promised people a certain number of acres for very cheap, as long as they were willing to rough it out there in the wild. And in fact, 1/5 of the people that went out to stake their claims came from Europe, as the railroads were being heavily advertised there. And this eventually led to the creation of a Granger Party and Granger Laws, which were movements that were eventually created laws, Granger laws, to protect the social interests of the families of the farmers, and of course, the farmers' economic interests themselves. Of course, women still did not have the right to vote at this point in time. This would not happen until 1919, so well into the 20th century, unfortunately. There were very few career women, women who did work in the cities, for example, in department stores, were mainly young and would normally, once married, leave their jobs and take care of their homes. Although women that came from lower social economic classes did tend to stay on longer, as the income of their partners was generally insufficient to be able to run a household. Here on your screen, you'll notice that on the left-hand side, there are a few women that have a sign behind them that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." These are the defenders of the temperance movement. They were women who had seen the evils of alcohol and their effects on particularly their husbands and fathers, brothers, the male members of their family, primarily, not obviously in every case. But this was enough to discourage them from the idea that, alcohol in moderation isn't necessarily something that's bad. They were in favor of getting rid of it entirely. And on the right-hand side, we have an example of suffragettes. Suffragettes were women who were seeking suffrage, meaning they wanted the right to vote. And it says, "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex." And this was a quote. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most famous suffragettes in United States history. Social thought, classical liberalism, really. There was something called social Darwinism, which was basically the idea that would justify the division of the wealthy and the not wealthy. So basically, survival of the fittest, which goes a little hand in hand with what we mentioned previously with laissez-faire economy. The Theory of the Leisure Class, which was a work by a Norwegian-American economist, Thorstein Veblen, argued that conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure of the wealthy had become the de facto of social status in America. This was a time when people were trying to identify what to do with all this extra cash that we have. And for some people, it was let's sort of channel it towards helping out everybody else. But for others, it was like, well, I was able to pick myself up by my bootstraps and look at this multimillionaire that I am today, without realizing all of the other contributing factors that went into that story. So yeah, in conclusion, just to say that this was a relatively vibrant time, a lot of changes were taking place, and a lot of the steps were being taken to be placed for further change that was yet to come by the 20th century. Later on, we see in the progressive era a lot more effort being taken on the part of the government to take care of its citizens. Not quite as much in the Gilded era, but yeah, that is a story for another time. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about this time period with us today. Take care.